January 17, 1946, Nordhausen, Germany. Deep beneath the Harz Mountains. The air is cold, but the chill is not merely of the subterranean stone. It is the deep lingering cold of an empire's collapse, a mausoleum of ambition. Water drips, echoing in the vast carved-out caverns of the Mittelwerk factory. Tunnels now choked with rusting machinery and the ghost of forced labor. The only light comes from the swing lamps of American soldiers, their breath clouding in the sharp, freezing air. They are not looking for treasure. They are looking for fragments of brilliance. A young American captain, his uniform too crisp for this cavernous grave, runs his gloved hand across the scarred concrete. He sees not a factory, but a blueprint for the future. He is part of an operation given the cold administrative designation, Operation Overcast, soon to be rechristened Paperclip. The conflict had ended in May, the guns silenced across Europe. But the silence was a lie. A new war had already begun, a war of theorems, thrust, and tonnage. The atomic flash over Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been the closing salvo of the old war, and the opening bell for a terrifying, invisible new one. A race not for territory but for the minds that could build a future weapon. The objective was clear, the mission ruthless: seize the human capital of the defeated enemy. Not merely the documents, though those were vital, bundled and packed into thousands of tons of shipping crates, but the men who held the formulae in their heads. The Wissenschaftler. For years, the best minds of the Third Reich and Imperial Japan had been harnessed to a singular, murderous goal. They had designed rockets that flew faster than sound, chemical processes that yielded synthetic oil from coal, and aircraft that could outpace Allied fighters. Now these minds were loose, scattered among the rubble, waiting for the victors to claim their prize. The moment mattered because it was the instant where morality met utility, where the ideals of freedom and democracy were forced to reconcile with the pragmatism of survival. Could a nation built on justice knowingly employ the architects of injustice? The answer, delivered in the shadow of the Mittelwerk and the tunnels of the V2, was a decisive, chilling yes. For men like Wernher von Braun, chief architect of the V2 rocket, and his team, the expectation was simple: trial and vengeance. They believed they would face the same tribunals and the same gallows as the political architects of the regime. They were, after all, the technical arm of the war machine. They had signed the orders, however reluctantly, that condemned slave laborers to death in the tunnels they now walked through. They expected chains, perhaps a dark cell in Nuremberg. The reality was radically different. It began with a handshake, a clean, well-fed American officer, a technical mind himself, offering a cigarette and a contract. They were not prisoners. They were assets. The contrast was immediate, sensory, and utterly disorienting. For 5 years, the German scientists had lived under the tyranny of Mangelwirtschaft, the economy of scarcity. Every drop of fuel, every sheet of metal, every loaf of bread was rationed, accounted for, and directed by the needs of the Krieg. Their world was gray, metallic, and constantly hungry. Then came the arrival, not in a prison wagon, but in a comfortable, albeit monitored, transport. They were transferred first to interrogation centers like Dustbin and Kranzberg Castle, and then, for the elite rocket men, across the Atlantic. The sea voyage was a blur of uncertainty, but the moment they stepped onto American soil, Texas, a sun-baked, endless expanse, the shock was total. Their new home was Fort Bliss, an army post near El Paso. They were given bungalows, not cells. They were given work, not judgment. But it was in the commissary, a small, brightly lit store filled with an impossible array of goods, that the true ideological earthquake occurred. There, arrayed on shelves that stretched to infinity, were objects of frivolous desire, of unnecessary choice, colors, packaging, and an abundance that mocked their years of carefully managed austerity. And standing at the apex of this commercial peak, the recurring, ubiquitous symbol of the new sovereign power, the Coca-Cola bottle. It was a simple glass bottle, curved and cool, filled with a fizzy, sweet brown syrup. For the German scientist, accustomed to the austere beauty of a perfectly machined engine part, this object represented a terrifying, incomprehensible waste of resources. It had no military purpose. It was pure pleasure, pure luxury, manufactured on a scale that dwarfed the German war machine's production of necessary evils like Zyklon B or synthetic rubber. The sheer, effortless ubiquity of the Coca-Cola bottle became the silent symbol of American abundance and democracy. It wasn't the tanks or the planes that shattered their ideology. It was the soft drink. The German regime, built on the premise of racial and industrial superiority, had failed to feed its own people or offer them even this most basic, inexpensive luxury. America, the land of decadent capitalism, could drown its citizens in it. The bottle was a monument to surplus, a testament to a system that could afford to be inefficient, yet still win the World War. The cold calculus of Paperclip. The official history of Operation Paperclip records the transfer of over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States between 1945 and 1959. The documentation is meticulous: travel manifests, security screening reports, and most chillingly, the derogatory information waivers. Under the original directive, anyone found to have been a fervent Nazi or a security threat was to be excluded. But as the Cold War temperature rose and the Soviet Union began snatching their own prizes, men like Helmut Grotrup for their rocket program, the moral gatekeepers were quickly bypassed. A 1946 directive from the Joint Chiefs of Staff stated, "The United States government is committed to utilizing the services of those selected enemy scientists and specialists, whose skills are invaluable to our nation's defense." In one documented case, the intelligence community noted that a selected scientist was classified as 100% Nazi, a dangerous opportunist. The military's response was simple. The paperclip was executed, and the derogatory file was literally clipped off the main folder, ensuring the scientist's passage. The name of the operation was, in fact, a bureaucratic euphemism for the deliberate whitewashing of war crimes. The factual records of the transfers are clinical. From Bremerhaven, scientists and their families, sometimes 100 people on a single C-54 Skymaster, or aboard ships like the SS Argentina, were delivered to the isolation of the New Mexico desert. They were given the equivalent of a soldier's pay and tasked with immediately rebuilding the V-2 infrastructure. Here, the emotional contrast deepened. In Germany, von Braun had labored under the constant paranoid threat of the SS, where a failed test could mean execution. In America, failure was a budget problem, not a capital offense. They were given access to resources beyond their wildest dreams. Unlimited computing power, primitive by modern standards, but revolutionary then, vast tracts of land for testing, white sands proving ground, and an open-ended financial commitment. Dr. Hubertus Strughold, the so-called father of space medicine, whose work involved horrifying, high-altitude, low-pressure experiments on concentration camp prisoners, was integrated into the U.S. Air Force's School of Aviation Medicine. The evidence is clear. The American government did not merely tolerate the moral failings of its new assets. It sanitized them and placed them in positions of extreme influence. A price was paid for speed, and that price was the erasure of ethical oversight. The Dark Exchange. Japanese biological warfare. Data, the secret American operation, was not confined to German rocket men. A parallel and far more ethically disturbing exchange was conducted in the Pacific Theater. This was the dark underbelly of Paperclip's pragmatism. The Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 731, based near Harbin in occupied Manchuria, was responsible for the most extensive and horrific biological warfare program in history. They conducted vivisections, frostbite tests, and live human infection experiments with anthrax, plague, cholera, and typhus on thousands of victims, whom they euphemistically referred to as Maruta, or logs. The evidence of Unit 731's crimes was voluminous, but the U.S. military had a unique opportunity. General Douglas MacArthur, seeking to secure Japan's cooperation in the post-war order, made a critical covert decision. Instead of pursuing war crimes charges against the unit's leader, General Shiro Ishii, and his staff, a quid pro quo was offered. The exchange was simple: immunity from prosecution in exchange for their biological data. Factual records show that U.S. investigators, notably Dr. Edwin Hill and later General Alden Waite, prioritized the scientific data over justice. A 1947 document confirmed the deal. Data on human experimentation, such as was done by Unit 731, is unique and could not be duplicated in the U.S. because of ethical restraints. The transfer included over 8,000 slides, countless petri dishes, detailed documentation of human experimentation, and the expertise of the scientists themselves. For the Japanese scientists of Unit 731, the emotional contrast was even more profound than for their German counterparts. They had expected execution for mass murder. They received academic sanctuary. They were not integrated into public research like the German rocket men, but their findings formed the foundation of the U.S. biological defense program for decades. They were given their lives back, the ultimate prize in exchange for the ultimate betrayal of humanity. This whole arrangement highlights the true ideological shift. The American system, in its desperate competition against the Soviet Union, demonstrated that scientific utility had, for a time, fully eclipsed moral ideology. The pursuit of the ultimate defensive and offensive weapon systems justified any means, any bargain with the devil. The transformation of ideology. The men of Paperclip were not simply transported, they were transformed. This transformation was catalyzed by two things: the endless resources and the pervasive, subtle culture of American consumerism. The German scientist had viewed his work as serving the Volk and the Führer, a rigid ideological master. The Japanese scientist served the divine emperor and the imperial state, a totalitarian honor-bound master. In America, they served science under the enabling umbrella of capital. In Fort Bliss, the scientific team was allowed to attend local gatherings. Here, the recurring symbol of abundance was inescapable. The Coca-Cola bottle wasn't just in the commissary. It was at every picnic, every 4th of July celebration, every ball game. It was cheap, accessible, and consumed with a casual disregard for scarcity. One scientist, Dr. Kurt DeBoos, who would go on to be the first director of the Kennedy Space Center, noted in a private journal that the lack of military oversight over something so readily available was a psychological marvel. In Germany, even water was a strategic concern. Here, a sugary drink was wasted on children. This perceived waste was, in fact, the greatest strength of the democracy they now lived under. The capacity for seemingly unlimited production, a capacity that could be instantly redirected from soda to satellites. The German scientists were soon exposed to the full democratic machine. They witnessed elections, the freedom of the press, which occasionally, but weakly questioned their presence, and the easygoing nature of the American soldier, who lacked the rigid, goose-stepping formality of the Wehrmacht. Their ideology, built on Prussian discipline and racial superiority, began to crumble not through forceful re-education, but through sheer exposure to operational success. The Allied victory, they realized, was not an accident of fate. It was the result of a system that allowed private industry to innovate and produce at a scale no centrally planned, totalitarian state could ever match. The most profound transformation occurred in their sense of purpose. Under the Reich, their purpose was conquest. Under the United States, their purpose became exploration. The V-2, a weapon of terror aimed at London, was rebranded as the vehicle of space exploration. The goal shifted from reducing London to rubble to reaching the moon. The American dream, often derided as frivolous materialism, offered a pragmatic bargain. Absolute scientific freedom, provided the ultimate product served the nation's security. It was a powerful, intoxicating offer. The guilt of Mittelwerk was not erased, but it was transcended by the grand, almost religious promise of the cosmos. Their past sins were exchanged for a share in America's future glory. The arc of the rocket and the taste of freedom, the factual evidence of this transformation, culminates in the Texas desert. The scattered V-2 components shipped across the Atlantic were reassembled by the same men who had overseen their initial construction. In the early days, the work was arduous. The scientists had to communicate through interpreters, often using their hands and salvage diagrams. They worked in the relentless desert sun, surrounded by a landscape utterly alien to the damp forests of their homeland. On September 15, 1945, the first static firing of a V-2 conducted on U.S. soil took place at White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico. It was a partial success, a plume of acrid smoke rising into the pale blue sky. But it was a promise. Over the next 3 years, 67 V-2 rockets would be launched from White Sands, carrying not warheads but scientific instruments. This was Project Hermes, the official scientific arm of Paperclip. The data gathered on atmospheric pressure, cosmic radiation, and guidance systems was immediately incorporated into the burgeoning American missile program. The names were changed. The V-2 became the basis for the Redstone, then the Jupiter, then the Saturn V. During the long, dusty hours of preparation, the simple pleasures of their new life underscored the ideological shift. The German teams working side by side with American GIs would take breaks. The Americans would invariably produce a cooler, the ice sweating in the high desert heat, and inside, stacked in symmetrical, shining rows, were the curves of the symbolic object. The Coca-Cola bottle, now familiar, was no longer a sign of decadent waste. It was part of the background, a guaranteed constant. It represented the seamless efficiency of the American supply chain, the kind of logistical machine that could, ironically, fuel a war effort as successfully as it could distribute a soft drink to the remotest desert outpost. It was the taste of the system that had defeated their own, a system that could deliver both unparalleled destructive power and frivolous, accessible sweetness. The factual data of the American triumph is now history. The Explorer-Sheen satellite, the Apollo program, the moon landing itself, every arc traced in the sky by an American rocket can be traced back to the blood-stained ingenuity of the Mittelwerk. The transformation was complete. Werner von Braun, the SS officer who used slave labor, became Dr. von Braun, the American patriot, celebrated on magazine covers, testifying before Congress, and eventually receiving the Distinguished Service Medal. The Faustian bargain was sealed with the ring of a soda bottle cap. Epilogue. The shadow of the war, however, is long. The secret operation was a success in the narrowest, most pragmatic sense. It gave America an unassailable technological lead in the early years of the Cold War, and accelerated the journey to the stars. But the cost was an indelible stain on the fabric of American exceptionalism. The story of the German and Japanese scientists brought secretly to America is a profound meditation on the nature of ideology and utility. It reveals that in the desperate theater of global competition, the line between victor and accomplice can blur. Freedom, it turns out, is not merely an ideal. It is a resource, and like any resource, it can be bartered, exploited, and sold to the highest bidder. Or, in this case, to the most valuable mind. The men who came to America, escaping the wreckage of their totalitarian masters, did not simply find a new country. They found a new kind of power, the power of limitless resources married to the ambition of the American frontier. They traded the cold, metallic taste of military necessity for the cool, carbonated sweetness of opportunity. But if you listen closely to the faint, lingering echo of a successful rocket launch, you can still hear the distant collective sigh of the victims left behind, whose suffering funded the journey. And sometimes in the clinking of ice cubes, you can almost catch the bitter moral aftertaste that lingered beneath the refreshing sugar of that most American of symbols, the perpetually available, perfectly chilled Coca-Cola bottle, the symbol of a democracy so abundant, so self-assured, it could absorb the sins of its enemies and still quench the world's thirst.